30,000 years before the first Egyptian pharaoh drew breath, people here were already building, not shelters, not temporary camps scattered across a landscape they were simply passing through, engineered systems, stone architecture, and aquaculture networks sophisticated enough that modern researchers, when they first encountered the evidence, initially assumed the dating had to be wrong. It wasn't wrong. And what the archaeology has since confirmed about the civilization that existed on this continent before most of the ancient world had figured out how to plant a seed is one of the most significant, most systematically overlooked stories in all of human history. The problem with ancient Australia? There is a version of Australian history that most people were taught. It goes something like this. Aboriginal people arrived on the continent somewhere between 40 and 60,000 years ago, spread across the landscape, and then lived in small nomadic groups, moving with the seasons, hunting and gathering, leaving behind very little in the way of permanent structure or material culture until Europeans arrived in 1788 and the modern era effectively began. That version is not ancient history. It is a colonial assumption dressed up as a historical fact, and researchers have been quietly dismantling it for decades. The problem with that assumption begins with the evidence, or rather, it begins with the almost complete absence of any serious effort to look for evidence in the first place. For most of the 19th and 20th centuries, the intellectual framework governing how non-Aboriginal Australians understood Aboriginal culture was built entirely on the premise that nothing sophisticated had existed here before European contact, which meant that when archaeologists did encounter structures, systems, or artifacts that suggested otherwise, the standard response was either to date them conservatively, attribute them to natural processes, or simply not publish findings in terms that would challenge the established story too aggressively. That is not conspiracy. That is how dominant paradigms work in any field, in any era. The questions researchers ask are shaped by what they already believe is possible, and for a very long time the question nobody in Australian archaeology was seriously asking was whether Aboriginal people had built something. The question was always framed the other way around. How did these people survive without building anything? The answer, it turns out, is that the premise was false. They did build things, extraordinary things, and the evidence has been sitting in the landscape, some of it completely visible, some of it buried under a few centimeters of sediment, waiting for researchers willing to look at it without the filter of a 200-year-old assumption telling them in advance what they were and were not allowed to find. What followed when researchers finally did look properly is one of the most significant reappraisals in the history of Australian science. And it begins, of all places, in the wetlands of southwestern Victoria with a network of channels, walls and weirs that should not, according to everything the textbooks once said, exist at all. The structures that shouldn't exist across the Australian continent, if you know what you are looking at. The landscape is full of things that resist the standard explanation. Stone arrangements covering areas larger than a city block, fish traps engineered with such precision that they still function today, thousands of years after the people who built them were forcibly removed from the country surrounding them, grinding grooves cut into sandstone platforms beside rivers in concentrations that suggest not occasional use by passing travellers, but sustained, repeated, high-volume food processing carried out by communities returning to the same location across hundreds of generations. The Brewarina fish traps in northwestern New South Wales are perhaps the most visually arresting example. Sitting in the Barwon River, a complex network of stone weirs and holding pools stretches across a wide section of the river in an arrangement that functions as an extraordinarily efficient fish harvesting system. The stones are fitted together without mortar in an interlocking configuration that allows water to flow through while trapping fish in holding chambers where they can be selectively harvested without depleting the entire population. Modern hydrological engineers who have examined the traps have noted that the design demonstrates a sophisticated working understanding of water flow, fish behavior, and sustainable yield management. The Nyemba people, whose country this is, describe these structures as among the oldest human-made constructions on Earth. Some researchers who have studied them are not inclined to argue the point, and here is the thing that stops most people for a moment when they first hear it. These traps are not described in any standard Australian history curriculum as an architectural achievement. The phrase you will hear used about the Brewerina fish traps in most educational settings, if they are mentioned at all, is something like a traditional fishing method, which is technically accurate the same way you could describe the Colosseum as a traditional Roman entertainment venue. Accurate, wildly insufficient, missing the actual point almost entirely. Similar stone arrangements appear across the continent with a frequency and scale that has only recently begun to be systematically mapped. In the Flinders Ranges of South Australia, stone arrangements and grinding sites suggest occupation patterns of extraordinary continuity. In the Pilbara of Western Australia, petroglyphs and stone features are now being dated to timescales that place them among the oldest human, artistic and structural records anywhere in the world. The map of significant, permanent or semi-permanent Aboriginal construction sites across this continent is not a map of a few isolated curiosities. It is a map of a civilization, and the single most compelling piece of evidence for what that civilization was actually capable of sits in a volcanic landscape in Victoria that most Australians have never heard of, Budj Bim, the oldest aquaculture system on Earth. 6,000 years ago, give or take, the Gunditjmara people of southwestern Victoria were farming eels, not catching them opportunistically as they migrated through waterways, farming them in a deliberately engineered network of channels, weirs and holding pools carved into and built across a basalt landscape left behind by a volcanic eruption that the Gunditjmara oral tradition still carries an account of, making it one of the oldest recorded descriptions of a geological event in human history. The name of that landscape is Budj Bim, and in 2019 it became the first place in Australia to be listed on the UNESCO World Heritage Register exclusively for its cultural significance, rather than for any natural feature of the landscape it sits in. Take a moment with that. The Great Barrier Reef is on the World Heritage List, the wet tropics are on it, Kakadu is on it, Budj Bim is now on it too, not because of the volcanic geology or the ecology of the wetlands, but because of what human beings built there and how long ago they built it. UNESCO's listing explicitly recognizes the Budj Bim aquaculture system as one of the world's most extensive and oldest examples of aquaculture. Oldest in the world, not in Australia, on Earth. The system itself covers an area of approximately 100 square kilometres across the Tarahumara Indigenous Protected Area and adjacent properties. The channels that Gunditjmara people cut through the basalt landscape to direct water flow from Lake Condah and surrounding wetlands are in places still visible today exactly as they were constructed. Some have been cleared and restored by Gunditjmara people working with Parks Victoria in recent years, and they function. The water still moves through them the way it was designed to move 6,000 years ago, which is either an extraordinary engineering achievement or a very awkward fact for anyone still clinging to the idea that the people who built this were simply wandering through the countryside. The eel species being farmed was the short-finned eel Anguilla australis, a species that accumulates significant fat reserves before migrating to spawn and can be smoked and preserved for long periods, effectively giving the Gunditjmara a storable food surplus of the kind that, in every other part of the world where it appears, is identified as a foundational precondition for settled, complex society, because that is what a storable food surplus does. It frees people from the requirement of constant movement in search of food and creates the conditions under which communities can remain in one place, develop specialized skills, build permanent structures, and accumulate the kind of multi-generational knowledge that produces increasingly sophisticated systems over time, the Gunditjmara did not remain nomadic because they lacked the capacity for settled life. The archaeological record at Budj Bim shows stone hut foundations, middens indicating long-term occupation, and a landscape so thoroughly modified by sustained human management that researchers studying it have compared the deliberate engineering involved to the agricultural transformations of the ancient Near East on a comparable timeline and on a comparable scale of sophistication for the population and environment involved. They were not wandering, they were home, they had been home for a very long time, and the system they built to sustain that home is older than the pyramids by roughly 1,000 years. The Lake Condah question. When archaeologists first began seriously excavating the Lake Condah area in the 1980s and 1990s, what they found beneath the sediment generated a level of academic controversy that was, to put it diplomatically, somewhat disproportionate to what the evidence actually required. Stone hut foundations in concentrations and configurations consistent with semi-permanent or permanent village settlement kept appearing in contexts that made the nomadic model of Aboriginal life in this region very difficult to maintain. Some researchers responded by questioning the dating, some questioned whether the structures were actually huts, a few questioned whether the entire framework needed to be reconsidered. That last group turned out to be right. The structures are huts. The dating is solid. By the time the full body of archaeological work at Lake Condah was synthesized in the early 2000s, the picture that emerged was of a community that had been living in permanent or semi-permanent stone dwellings beside a managed aquaculture system for thousands of years, not seasonally, not intermittently, continuously, in the way that any settled agricultural community anywhere else in the ancient world would be described as living continuously in a place they had made their own. Gunditjmara elder uncle Denny Watt has described the stone houses at Lake Condah in terms that cut through the academic debate more cleanly than any research paper. His people always knew the houses were there. The knowledge that Gunditjmara people lived in stone structures, managed the waterways, and maintained a sophisticated economy around eel farming was never lost to the community itself. What was lost for a period of about 200 years was any serious interest from outside that community in treating what Gunditjmara people said about their own history as evidence worth taking seriously. The Lake Condah excavations changed that, slowly and imperfectly, in the way that most fundamental shifts in scientific understanding tend to happen, not through a single dramatic announcement, but through an accumulation of evidence that eventually became too heavy to keep explaining away. What the sediment at Lake Condah contained was not just the remains of a sophisticated settlement, it was a direct physical refutation of one of the foundational assumptions of Australian colonial history. And that, more than any single artefact, is why the Lake Condah question mattered as much as it did. The Madjedbebe revelation. A rock shelter changed everything we thought we knew. In 2017, a team of researchers published findings from a site in the Northern Territory called Madjedbebe that sent a very specific kind of shockwave through the global archaeology community. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that arrives in the pages of an academic journal and then spends several years slowly dismantling our assumptions that entire careers were built on, while the rest of the world goes about its business, completely unaware that the ground has shifted underneath it. The finding was this: human occupation of Australia extended back at least 65,000 years, making Madjedbebe the oldest confirmed site of human habitation outside Africa anywhere on Earth. Not the oldest in the Southern Hemisphere, not the oldest in the Pacific region, the oldest outside Africa on the planet. 65,000 years is a figure that deserves more than a moment of polite acknowledgement before moving on. The earliest confirmed evidence of anatomically modern humans in Europe sits at roughly 45,000 years ago. The earliest confirmed evidence in the Americas lands somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years ago. The people who left their tools and ochre and carefully worked stone at Madjedbebe were already living in Australia, already building detailed knowledge of this specific landscape 20,000 years before the first modern human being set foot anywhere in Europe. When those people were going about their daily lives in the Northern Territory, Neanderthals were still walking around in Spain. That is not a metaphor for a long time. That is literally how long ago this was. The artifacts themselves compound the significance considerably. Among the items recovered at Madjedbebe were ground-edge axes, a technology involving a deliberately ground and polished cutting edge, rather than a simply napped one that researchers had previously believed appeared independently in multiple parts of the world at various points after 30,000 years ago. The Madjedbebe axes are older than every other known example of this technology anywhere in the world. Not slightly older, substantially older. The people living at this site were not behind the rest of humanity in technological capability in this specific and measurable category. They were ahead of it, and by a margin large enough that it required a fundamental revision of how the global timeline of human technological development had been understood. Pause on that for a second, because it genuinely warrants it. If archaeologists had uncovered the world's oldest ground-edge axes at a site in ancient Mesopotamia or the Nile Valley, that finding would have generated international headlines, museum exhibitions, and at least one breathless documentary with dramatic orchestral music. In the context of Australian Aboriginal history, it filtered into the broader public conversation over the course of several years, quietly, without the fanfare, fitting a pattern in this field that has become almost predictable by now. The Mirarr people, traditional owners of the country where Madjedbebe sits, received the formal confirmation of the dating with something closer to recognition than surprise. Their ancestors were there. The living cultural tradition had never lost that knowledge. It had never needed an academic journal to confirm what the community already understood about the depth of their own presence on this land. That detail is not incidental. It is the thread that runs through almost every significant archaeological discovery in this entire field. Outside researchers arrive, apply their methods, and reach conclusions that the traditional owners of the country involved had quietly maintained all along. The knowledge was never missing. The listening was. The Stonehenge. Nobody talks about 50 kilometres west of Melbourne, on a basalt plain near the town of Little River. There is a stone arrangement that the people who study it describe carefully and precisely as astronomically aligned. The arrangement is called Wudi Yuwang, and it was made by the Wathaurong people, also known as the Wadawurrung, whose country this part of Victoria has always been. It consists of roughly 100 basalt stones arranged in an egg shape, approximately 50 metres at its widest point, with specific stones at the western end positioned to align with the setting sun at the summer solstice, the winter solstice, and the equinoxes. Let that settle for a moment. A stone arrangement on a Victorian basalt plain built by Aboriginal Australians, precisely aligned to 3 separate solar events, including both solstices and the equinox, the same basic astronomical knowledge that underpins Stonehenge in England, the Mnajdra temple complex in Malta, and the solar alignments built into dozens of ancient structures across the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Astronomer Duane Hamisher of the University of Melbourne, who has studied Wudi Yuwang in detail alongside Wathaurong elders, has published research concluding that the solar alignments at Wudi Yuwang are intentional, precise, and consistent with a sophisticated observational knowledge of solar movements across the annual cycle. The dating of Wudi Yuwang is, at this point, genuinely uncertain in a direction that should get more attention than it does. Attempts to date the arrangement directly have been complicated by the basalt composition of the stones themselves and the difficulty of applying standard dating techniques to the specific context. Wathaurong elders have indicated the arrangement is very old, and some researchers who have examined the site have proposed it could be considerably older than any comparable structure elsewhere in the world. Nobody is currently in a position to confirm that definitively. Nobody is currently in a position to rule it out either. What can be said with confidence is this: the Wathaurong people understood the movement of the sun across the annual cycle with enough precision to encode that understanding in stone permanently in a way that is still readable today. They did not need a written tradition to preserve complex astronomical knowledge across generations. They needed exactly what they had: a living oral tradition, a ceremonial structure for transmitting knowledge, and the stone arrangement itself as a physical reference point that could be read directly against the sky. That is not a primitive approach to astronomy, that is a functional one. The vanishing. What actually happened, here is where the script of this particular story has to be handled honestly. Because the word vanished, the word in the title, is doing something complicated that is worth unpacking before you accept it at face value. The civilization described in this video did not vanish the way the dinosaurs vanished, wiped out by a single catastrophic event that left the landscape empty. What happened was both simpler and far more brutal than a natural catastrophe, and calling it a vanishing risks, obscuring the specific documented human decisions that caused it. The Gunditjmara people who built Budj Bim were forcibly removed from their country in the 19th century. The stone houses at Lake Condah were demolished by mission authorities in the early 20th century, specifically to prevent Gunditjmara people from maintaining a permanent settlement on their own land and asserting the legal rights that permanent occupation would have supported. The fish traps at Budj Bim were deliberately blocked, the channels were filled, the eel farming economy that had sustained a community for 6,000 years was systematically dismantled, not by time, not by climate change, not by some internal collapse of the civilization itself, but by a deliberate colonial policy of removal, dispersal, and cultural erasure implemented within living memory of people whose grandchildren are alive today. The civilization did not vanish because it failed. It was interrupted forcibly and violently at a specific historical moment by a specific set of decisions made by specific people whose names are in the historical record. And that distinction matters enormously because a civilization that collapsed under its own weight is a tragedy. A civilization that was dismantled from the outside is something else entirely. It is a crime. And the physical evidence left behind, the channels at Budj Bim, the stone huts at Lake Condah, the fish traps at Brewarina, the astronomical alignment at Wudi Yuang, is not the remnant of something that failed. It is evidence of something that was working. What changed the landscape enough to obscure that evidence for so long was not geological time. It was 2 centuries of active, systematic effort to prevent Aboriginal people from asserting, maintaining, or being formally credited with the sophisticated civilization their ancestors built and their communities sustained. The archaeology that has emerged in the last 30 years is not discovering a lost civilization. It is recovering documentation of one that was never actually lost to the people who lived it. It was simply not being listened to, and that is a significantly different problem than a mystery. The volcanoes that created the Budj Bim landscape also feature in Gunditjmara oral tradition in enough specific geological detail that researchers studying the accounts believe they describe events from approximately 37,000 years ago, making them among the oldest oral traditions of any geological event in human history. A civilization that can carry accurate geological memory across 37,000 years of oral transmission is not a civilization that vanished. It is a civilization with a continuity of knowledge transmission that most of the ancient world's famous civilizations could not come close to matching. What we still don't know, researchers actively working in this field will tell you, with a consistency that itself says something important, that the honest answer to most of the biggest questions is still, we do not know yet. Not because the evidence is not there, but because the systematic study of Aboriginal material culture, architecture, and land management as evidence of complex civilization is, as a serious academic enterprise, still remarkably young. Most of the foundational work has happened in the last 30 years. Some of the most significant findings have happened in the last 10. The full extent of the Budj Bim aquaculture system has not been completely mapped. Satellite imagery and LiDAR scanning, the same aerial laser scanning technology that recently revealed massive, previously unknown urban infrastructure beneath the jungle canopy around Angkor Wat in Cambodia, has only begun to be systematically applied to Australian landscapes where Aboriginal construction and land modification might be present beneath vegetation or shallow sediment. Early results in several locations have been, to use the technical term, surprising. The researchers doing this work are careful about overstating preliminary findings, but the general direction of what the technology is revealing is toward greater scale and greater sophistication than anyone expected to find. The question of how widespread permanent or semi-permanent settlement was across the continent before European arrival remains genuinely open. The Lake Condah and Budj Bim evidence establishes that it occurred in southwestern Victoria at a large scale and over a long period. Evidence from other parts of the continent, the fish traps at Brewarina, the stone arrangements of the Flinders Ranges, the grinding sites along major river systems, suggest that the pattern was not unique to one region, but the systematic archaeology required to map it properly across the continent has barely begun. There is also the question of what the Madjedbebe findings actually imply about the 65,000 years of human activity in Australia that preceded European contact. 65,000 years is an almost incomprehensible span of time in which to imagine that nothing of significant complexity developed anywhere on a continent the size of Australia. The more reasonable assumption, the one that the emerging evidence consistently supports, is that we simply have not looked hard enough in enough places with enough willingness to find what is actually there. Here is the reframe that all of this evidence taken together actually demands. Australia was not a continent waiting to be discovered. It was a continent that had already been thoroughly understood, carefully managed and inhabited by sophisticated, socially complex, technologically capable peoples for longer than almost any comparable human story anywhere on Earth. The civilization that built Budj Bim, that engineered the Brewarina fish traps, that recorded volcanic eruptions in oral tradition across 37,000 years, that understood solar astronomy precisely enough to encode it in stone, was not a primitive precursor to civilization. It was civilization, operating on its own terms, in its own landscape, with its own logic, for an almost unimaginable span of time. It did not vanish, it was interrupted. And the interruption is recent enough and documented clearly enough that the word lost is probably the least accurate word in the title of this video. The knowledge was not lost, it was preserved, carried, and maintained by the communities whose ancestors built these systems through 2 centuries of active colonial effort to erase it. What got lost temporarily was the willingness of the outside world to listen. That willingness is, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to return. The UNESCO listing of Budj Bim in 2019, the formal return of the Daintree and Kalkajaka to traditional owner management in 2021, the growing body of peer-reviewed research treating Aboriginal land management, architecture, and astronomical knowledge as the sophisticated achievements they demonstrably are. These are not acts of charity, they are corrections, late, partial, and still ongoing corrections to a 200-year misreading of what this continent actually was and what the people who lived here actually built. The pyramids get the documentaries, the Greek temples get the school textbooks, Stonehenge gets the winter solstice live streams with 200,000 viewers and someone standing in the rain with a very enthusiastic energy. And somewhere in southwestern Victoria, a network of stone channels that is older than all of them still moves water through a basalt landscape exactly the way it was designed to, built by people whose descendants are still here, still on country, still carrying the knowledge, waiting with what must be an extraordinary amount of patience for the rest of us to catch up.